And I'm the director of the Jack, Joseph, and Morton Mandel Center for Advanced Holocaust Studies here at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. It is our center's mission to provide for the continued growth of the field of Holocaust studies through programs such as this one that we put on every year. And I hope, while I have the floor, may I ask you to take the opportunity when you leave tonight to learn more about our many programs from the printed materials that we have available on the tables just outside. So let me begin tonight's program with some words of appreciation for Dr. Janice Weinman Shorenstein and her family. Dr. Shorenstein endowed this lecture in 1995 as a tribute to her parents, Monna and Otto Weinman, and to all Holocaust survivors. We owe a special debt of gratitude to the Weinmans and to all Holocaust survivors for telling their stories and inspiring the creation of this institution, the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. Their voices still ring strong here, and it is our duty to ensure to them that those voices will continue to be heard for generations. And Janice was one of the earliest to commit to our institution, commitment to survivor stories and to scholarship. And it's this commitment that has enabled us to invite the world's leading scholars to come up to our stage and share their research and perspectives on survivors' experiences from this stage every year. This is the 29th annual Weinman Lecture. And I should say, actually, this lecture is even older than the Mandel Center itself, the oldest endowed lecture at our museum. So we're very delighted and lucky that Janice Weinman Shorenstein herself has attended every one of the Weinman lectures, and she and her husband, Stuart Shorenstein, are here with us tonight. It's now my pleasure to invite Janice up to the podium to share a few words of her own. Janice, come on up.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for coming on this very rainy, miserable evening. I'm very grateful to you. His words resonated so powerfully to us that people started to cry. Ophir Zafrani, the principal of the Danziger Science and Technology School in Kiryat Shmona in northern Israel, described the plight of his students who are refugees in their own country. Kiryat Shmona has been practically razed to the ground. And since having been evacuated from their homes and schools, the children in that community have been dispersed to hotels and makeshift schools for over a year. Some live with their parents and siblings in only one room in whatever facility can house them. Others, having lost both parents, have been sent to orphanages where they are supported by the care of professional caregivers. I visited those children in the spring of 2024, and just as much as I cried listening to Principal Zafrani describe the plight of families broken apart and dispersed through their own country, my heart was torn when I saw boys and girls trying to cope with separation and sense of loss. Some had difficulty speaking, some struggled with eye contact, others withdrew from any form of human interaction. The trauma of separation from their families left them stranded emotionally, functionally, and contextually. Yet, and I want to say that these children are not unique. The enduring emotional consequences of trauma resulting from destruction and displacement are taking place in other parts of the Middle East, in Eastern Europe, and many parts of Africa. Dr. Doron will share with us stories and consequences of the painful experience of families during the Holocaust. In some respects, history has repeated itself again, with families subjected to the onslaught of torture, death, or dislocation. The dramatic rise of mental health disorders, of deep-rooted uncertainty, and of disrupted normalcy has left a deep scar on the youth of battered nations in many parts of the world. Struggling to balance their personal lives, their academic demands, and the loss of familial and community security, these children are often the lost generation in their own countries. And yet, in reading Dr. Doron's article about the subject that she will discuss tonight, entitled Feeling Familial Separation, Emotion, Agency, and Holocaust Refugee Youth, I was struck by the coping mechanisms of these children. Suppression of emotion, mental disassociation from the painful experience, and adaptation were prevalent. One of the main responses to their condition was to assert a sense of independence and control over their environments. Last week, I had the privilege of spending some time with Michal Herzog, the wife of the Israeli president. She described the dramatic rise of PTSD in her country, so I asked her what she thought would help children separated, either temporarily or permanently, from their families. She responded immediately and definitively that giving these youth opportunities to exhibit independence and control was the only way to rehabilitate them back to a sense of normalcy. As the youth of the Holocaust who came to the United States at the end of World War II had to find their way, establish their independence, and take control over their circumstances, so do many youth now in war-torn parts of the world need to find themselves towards their paths for the future. Unfortunately, throughout history and currently across the world, this remains a constant tragedy and challenge that we face. Families disrupted, separated, torn apart by hostility, destruction, and even torture, needing to establish their own stability and security. This museum stands as a memory to those lost, but also a testimony to those who overcame their persecution and displacement. May we all continue to work toward a world without human suffering, but more immediately and more directly now, to embrace the responsibility of providing opportunities for those who experience grief and loss to reestablish themselves as functioning, contributing members of whatever society in which they live. Thank you to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum and to Dr. Doron for giving us the opportunity to explore tonight this very important and timely topic. Thank you so much.
Janice, those words were very inspiring and moving. Thank you so much. And now it is my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Dr. Daniella Doron. Daniella is Assistant Professor of Jewish Studies at Colgate University, and she joined the faculty of Colgate just last year in 2023 after over a decade of teaching and research at Monash University in Melbourne, Australia. Before that, she received her PhD in history as well as Hebrew and Judaic studies from New York University. And she's the author of, among other things, Jewish Youth and Identity in Post-War France, Rebuilding Family and Nation, which you can find outside because our bookstore has gotten some copies. It's a really wonderful book that originally came out in 2015. And she is now working on another book called Young Border Crossers, Jewish Youth During the Ages of Migration. Dr. Doron, I must say, is a longtime friend of the Mandel Center. She conducted her dissertation research here as a Life Reborn Fellow for research on displaced persons during the 2006-2007 academic year. So it's my pleasure to welcome her back to the museum and up to the stage to deliver this year's 2024 Weinman Actual Lecture. Her title is Families Torn Apart, Jewish Child Refugees in the United States, 1933 to 1945. Daniella.
Good evening, and I want to thank the museum and this lecture series for this invitation. Many pivotal intellectual and other moments in my life have taken place in this building, so I'm truly honored and just thrilled to be here this evening. So thank you very much, and thank you for coming out on a very rainy night, so I appreciate everyone's attendance tonight. I would like to begin this evening with a story. In 1947, 18-year-old Phyllis Matson, née Lizzie Finkel, began to take stock of her life's hard knocks. Matson had arrived in the United States 7 years earlier as an 11-year-old Austrian Jew who had crossed the Atlantic Ocean with assistance of an unaccompanied child migration scheme. Her life in foster families and children's homes were lonesome, even tumultuous experiences. And yet Manson's voluminous wartime correspondence with her far-off parents often tried to mask her pain and her vulnerability. As the wartime period slipped into the post-war era, Matson decided to pen a letter for her eyes only. This exercise helped her reflect upon the emotional wall that she had constructed between herself and others, and the toll that this emotional labor took on her stability and social relationships. For too long a time, she wrote, I'd had a barbed wire fence around me, and it was very hard, if not impossible, for anyone to penetrate. How and why did refugee youth like Matson, as they endured familial separation and ethnic persecution, experience, but also, and this is my real interest here, employ and perform emotions? We know from Matson's mother's letters that the 11-year-old had kept up the sunny demeanor during their last moments together when they bid farewell in Vienna. Can emotions such as excitement or anxiety drive mobility and agency? The generational gap between mother and daughter regarding their divergent views upon migration raises additional questions about how age can shape emotions and movement. Phyllis Matson's experiences and concealed emotions were shared by other Jewish youth at the mid-century. These youth have left an abundant and largely untapped trove of sources, many of which are here at this museum, in which they constructed narratives of their lives and emotions to their parents in letters, to their social workers in various interactions, and to themselves in their diaries. These rich sources invite us to probe further about the connection between emotions, lived experience, and the Holocaust. For historians of childhood, of which I am one too, it's tempting to celebrate the agency of children or our ability to access their voices and to document their unique experiences and perspectives. And for historians of the Holocaust, which I am also one, many have recently turned to the history of emotions, the emotions that come across so forcefully in Jewish sources from the Nazi era, to help us understand the Jewish decision-making calculus and their inner worlds, their felt experience. That is all valuable scholarship. But this evening, I want to use sources by and about refugee Jewish youth to think through their stories, the stories that Jews tell about their experiences at the time and also retrospectively, and how factors such as age or emotions can complicate our ability to document and understand these narratives. And so in this evening's talk, I wish to focus on the expressed emotions of Jewish children like Phyllis Mattson, who experienced familial separation during the Nazi years. The emotions that Jewish youth verbalized rather than what they felt. While refugee youth undeniably felt a range of emotions, I would like to suggest this evening that the stated emotions of Holocaust-era Jews tell us less about their emotional inner lives or explain their choices than it does about power relations within Jewish families and among Jews. In a moment in which Jews, including Jewish youth, were stripped of power by the Nazis, certainly, but also by adults making monumental decisions about their life. Refugee youth and their parents deployed certain emotions and minimized others in an attempt to exert control over themselves, within their biological families, and the other adults in their lives. Emotional expression served the effort to exert or subvert power in a topsy-turvy world. So I just want to give you a sense of historical background here, since I think this story, though it is actually, depicted in the Americans of the Holocaust exhibit here in the museum, but I think it's a little less well known. So efforts to facilitate the exit of Jewish children out of Nazi Germany were actually set in motion soon after the Nazis' ascension to power, and then continued in fits and starts into 1944. A small proportion of the youth who made their way to the United States did so through ad hoc efforts arranged by their parents. But the vast majority participate in organized child migration scheme. The German Jewish Children's Association, founded in 1934, represented one of the more prominent agencies in the work of assisting unaccompanied Jewish minors to take refuge in the US. And then as conditions shifted over the course of Nazi rule, this organization, the GJCA, allied with a range of organizations, Jewish communal agencies in Vienna and Berlin, Quaker relief workers operating out of French internment camps, and then Jewish and sectarian agencies in America in arranging the exit of Jewish youth out of Europe. Now, Central and Western European youth largely dominated the refugee cohort. And they ranged in age from 14 months to 16 years old, though the vast majority were prepubescent and pubescent. And their experiences in Nazi Europe varied widely. So final numbers are impossible to tally, but by 1945, well over 1,000 unaccompanied refugee children made their way to the United States with the assistance of the German Jewish Children's Aid and other partner organizations. So as they first landed in the United States, adults took note of the contrast between the youth's outward appearance and their expressed feelings. In the eyes of social workers helping young refugees navigate their first moments in the United States, Unaccompanied minors appeared curiously calm and subdued. Lotte Marcuse, placement director of the German Jewish Children's Aid, observed that learning to control emotions had already begun years before the act of migration. German Jewish children had been taught to adopt a rigid self-control in response to Nazi anti-Semitic acts and hostility. It was her experience at refugee youth carried this emotional reserve with them to the United States. Her work helping refugee youth disembark from steamers and navigate border controls in Ellis Island, and then acquainting them with New York City and their new host families, cemented this conviction. When Marcuse, originally from Germany, helped several Viennese children disembark the steamer in New York City in 1941, she took note of their attempts at controlling their anxiety. Sigmar Schonenberg's outward appearance betrayed his pitched levels of anxiety as he passed through border control. He shuffled his papers, he bit his lip, he played with his hair, and he adapted, in his words, a tense expression. But when Marcuse offered a few reassuring words, he objected to her suggestion that he was afraid. "I'm not scared," he said. "Why would I be?" It may be that emotional reserve impeded the youth from taking stock of their emotional weight and the gravity of their situation, and thereby make peace with their circumstances. But emotional regulation likewise served to mask their anxiety and vulnerability. And I will return to this fellow Ernst Papanek a bit later, but he very much studied these youth and also took note of their emotional state. The first letters that children wrote to their parents trapped in Europe speak to how emotional censorship extended to even the closest of kin, parents. We can understand the conspicuous absence of emotions and honesty in multiple and overlapping ways. It could be that youth of all ages recognized the extreme vulnerability of their families faced in Nazi Europe, and that familial separation served as an additional source of anxiety for already stressed parents. This awareness could have inspired youth to assuage their parents' concern and avoid compounding their troubles. That refugee youth felt compelled to take responsibility for their parents' emotional well-being speaks to the inverted family hierarchy witnessed during the Holocaust. An additional interpretation lies in the possibility that refugee youth consciously or unconsciously stayed clear of voicing their emotions for fear that they would open up the emotional floodgate. To voice to their parents or even to themselves their emotional turmoil may have seemed to place yet a further obstacle to their adaptation. And crucially, emotional concealment may have served the purpose of projecting power and control in one's life. While some children lamented their familial separation, many letters painted a rosy picture of life in America. Hans Gutz assured his parents that his new life in Rochester, with all the snow and ice, is wonderful. Kurt Rosenfelder started his letter alleviating any anxiety his parents in Nuremberg may have felt. "I like it here very much. I do not want to go back," he wrote to them. When relations with foster parents turned sour, which was a common experience among foster families and their charges, refugee youth largely avoided exposing their feelings and their complaints to their parents. Much to her surprise and consternation, Lily Lozer learned of her daughter's removal from their foster family weeks later. Only after Gabi and Utah left Maplewood, New Jersey for Newark did Pauline Stein, their ex-foster mother, appraise Lozer of the discordant relations in her household. Her daughter and Juta's temperament clashed a lot, she wrote, and she found herself often, in her words, becoming irritable with all the children bickering and running afoot. In some, she believed it, quote, advisable that your children get into a more peaceful household, end quote. Lily Lozer had remained in the dark. Gabi and Juta's infrequent and cheery letters failed to make mention of trouble stewing in their home. The voluminous letters between the teenager Richard Shifter, later to hold important Department of State positions in the Reagan administration, and his Viennese parents speak to how young people not only engaged in emotional concealment, but worked to present themselves as competent and capable family leaders. Shifter, unlike many of the youth in this study, in this evening's talk, never participated in an organized child migration scheme. His parents, who had been born in Poland and thereby remained disadvantaged by the American quota system, sent their Austrian-born child to the United States alone to live with his uncle. In 1938, Shifter crossed Europe and the Atlantic Ocean by himself. Already in the first days of their separation, the adolescents set the tone of their correspondence. Competent and autonomous, he would successfully navigate and attempt to end their familial separation. Aboard the steamer, he proudly declared his lack of required assistance from adults. Quote, "I could see that I can arrange all the things alone, and I'm already very independent." End quote. Once settled with his great uncle in New York, the 15-year-old Shifter immediately put his sharp mind to schoolwork and to the work of assisting his parents. The Shifter clan, in fact, discussed little else. Rather, Shifter focused his touching letters on both his love for his parents and his various efforts to facilitate their exit from Europe. He took remarkable initiative. He reached out to consular officials and political luminaries throughout the globe. He researched information about promising escape routes and offered his parents advice and instructions. The governor of New York, the Cuban consulate in New York, the President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the Secretary of State, and the American consulate in Romania all received entreaties from the increasingly desperate and yet highly competent teenager. He projected his confidence in his letters to his parents. In the winter of 1939, he assured his father, "If you need a guarantee, then I'll certainly get it. If nothing comes of it, then I'll arrange for you to go to England, God willing." A few days later, again, he returned to the theme of his parents' planned departure. Quote, "I'm taking care of the England business. I hope that I can arrange it by the end of March or the beginning of April." Shifter's efforts on behalf of his parents were so extensive and all-consuming that his father eventually implored his son to instead focus on himself. As he tenderly tried to convince his son, quote, "So, dear Richard, I want to ask you to let the England thing go. Richard, I'm very sorry that I ever started writing to you about England. Look, my precious child, I know you want to do everything possible for your papa, but it's not working. Why should you rack your brains over my going to England when it won't work? And then you waste your time running around because of me when you yourself need free time after school. So now, Richard, leave England alone." But as the months and years wore on, Shifter assured his parents that he would continue, quote, "running around and researching alternative escape plans." As he described the inverted family hierarchy, the family now confronted, he now enjoyed the status of the, quote, "old world traveler," whereas they were the greenhorns. Paul Shifter did not entirely disagree. In 1939, in regard to the various closed doors he faced, he wrote to his son, "Write to me, Rishel, what you think I should do." Both parents and son acknowledged the inversion of power relations. More typically, refugee youth exerted a sense of autonomy and control by refusing to forge emotional ties with their foster families. From the perspective of foster children, emotional aloofness helped them tolerate living with strangers. This pattern of behavior cropped up so commonly that it pushed social workers to remain wary of placing children with free homes, families that volunteer to house a child without compensation. These families had initially responded to the call to shelter refugee youth, assuming that their generosity would be matched by the child's affection and gratitude. These expectations proved unrealistic, as several child welfare workers noted. Rather than finding a young child grateful for any and all gestures of care, foster families at times confronted youth who remained, quote, arrogant, aloof, unappreciative, and actually preferred Germany to America, unquote, in the words of a social worker. One 13-year-old outright refused foster home placement, and social workers concurred that they could not place this most charming girl because of her longing for her mother. Many other children's inability to meet the foster family's emotional needs routinely led to multiple changes of housing. By 1943, as I just mentioned, the evident emotional mismatch between foster families and refugee youth led one social worker to caution against ever placing children in free homes, since children proved, quote, unwilling or unable to meet the emotional needs of foster families. As already noted, youth commonly appeared emotional aloof and distant to their foster parents. Foster parents found this behavior confusing and alienating. Several social workers, for their part, observed that refugee children typically attempted to conceal their homesickness and their fears. For some, this strategy took the form of flawless behavior. Lillian Varshansky incorrectly believed that she could convince her rather rigid relatives to keep her on through impeccable behavior. Her efforts at housework and, quote, making herself indispensable in many little ways were to no avail. Her relatives requested that the agency find her a new home. A social worker offered another girl's extreme pliability regarding religious observance as evidence that children appeared, quote, over-anxious to please, unquote. Emotional concealment and the image of self-sufficiency, especially pertaining to foster parents or social workers, could have multiple origins and purposes. These youth could have feared their unstable living circumstances and worried that signs of vulnerability and disrupting the rhythm of the household might result in their removal. The needs of their parents might have been on their minds too, as they work to render themselves indispensable and lovable in their new foster families. It's possible that they believed that if they endeared themselves to their new foster families, these emotional bonds would increase the chance of assistance for their parents. Refugee youth arrived in the United States hoping that their new foster families would sponsor their natal families for visas or offer assistance upon arrival in the United States. One social worker noted that visas for parents figured, quote, uppermost in children's minds upon landing in the United States. And so, refugee youth hid their troubles from multiple interested parties, from their social workers, from their foster parents, from their parents, and potentially also from themselves. And these efforts to mask their vulnerability and project an image of power and control in their lives and families. And despite the distressing circumstances of their migration, discussions of empowerment, of control, of autonomy far outweighed verbalized reflections on victimhood, grief, and loss. These emotional preferences served multiple considerations: cementing their place in their foster family, assisting parents in obtaining longed-for visas, calming their own anxiety and that of their parents, and attempting to climb social and familial hierarchies. But if youth functioned as agents of emotional expression, they also served as objects of emotional formation. So we are all sites of emotional formation. At some point in our lives, we are taught to feel or display sadness at a funeral, for instance, gratitude upon receiving a present. I try to teach my child that all the time, and respect towards one's elders. But I want to complicate all of this. I think there are more explanations at play. We have to consider both the emotional language available to youth and the emotional language expected of youth. Among many considerations, these emotional expectations were shaped by age, by gender, and distinct national cultures. In terms of scholarship, in terms of gender, historical scholarship, in addition to other disciplines, as well as, common experience, has already helped us understand the gendered nature of emotion work. Emotion work means being aware of other people's emotions. And it can involve masking feelings, acting cheerful, and monitoring and trying to improve the emotional states of others. Gender is critical in emotion work. Girls are far more likely to be tasked with emotion work or a particular kind of emotion work. So just to give you an example, if we examine the rich correspondence of Lily Lozer, trapped in Portugal, and her two daughters in Newark, New Jersey, that's Gabi, who have met, we have a window into the emotional labor that Lozer expected of her two girls, Gabi, and especially her older daughter, Judy or Yuta. Lily Lozer's letters to her daughters overflowed with emotion. At moments, grief for her father and husband, anxiety for her sisters in hiding and in concentration camps, frustration with her long wait for a visa, and occasionally anger at her daughters for not writing enough. But above all, longing for her treasured girls. Separated from her daughters, Lozer wished her daughters to alleviate her anxiety. She chided them for the quantity and quality of their correspondence. And this became such an issue that she wrote to multiple agencies complaining that her daughters were not writing enough. Because she wished for confirmation of her primacy of place in her daughters' hearts. As she somewhat passive-aggressively opened her letter of December 1943, quote, "No mail yet from my darlings. I don't know what to think about. Sometimes I think you don't write, but then I don't believe that my good children forget to write to mommy. This is, of course, impossible, as I know you will never forget mommy." In essence, despite the ocean and years separating them, she wished to be assured that she was still their mother. On some level, the daughters complied. They attempted to assure their mother of their constant longing for her. routinely including in their letters fantasies and poems and pictures about their eagerly anticipated family reunion. The younger Gabi would offer pencil drawings of the three of them together. The elder Yuta adopted an especially mature and protective tone in her letters towards her mother, quote, her darling one. At one point, she suggested that she return to Europe if her mother felt, quote, too lonesome. Age may be an even more starkly salient category. Especially those on the ground in America sanctioned a degree of autonomy, independence, and even rebellious behavior from teenagers. One American social worker explained to Irma Zanger that she would have to come to terms with her diminished control over her teenage daughter. The caseworker urged Zanger to make her peace with the fact, quote, the child from whom she separated several years ago is now a grown person with her own ideas and plans. Many European parents find that especially hard to realize when their children wish to be just as grown up and independent as an American-born girl or boy of that ages. Younger children, however, were especially expected to fulfill the role of what the economic sociologist Viviana Zelizer has referred to as a economically useless but emotionally priceless child. I love that. In return for a home, foster families expected the performance of refugee childhoods, gratitude, dependence, and the kind of joy that children can bring to the life of a family. And caseworkers attributed successful family placements to those young children who successfully performed and navigated childhood roles within the foster family. In some, as one social worker explained to them, the emotional dynamics of many foster families, foster parents, quote, wanted the children to be theirs in feeling. Distinct national norms likewise shaped the emotional language expected of Jewish youth, as they traversed what scholars of emotion refer to as emotional frontiers. On one level, national cultures framed how American and European Jews perceived and described the youth, as well as presumably guided or steered the youth away from certain types of emotional expression. American ideals of independence and entrepreneurial spirit or self-starter initiative and resiliency come across forcefully in social worker case files and organizational memos. Children absorb the American ethos from their surroundings. When Ernst Papanek, an Atlanta psychologist, sent out a questionnaire to refugee youth, which included the question, how do you feel about being in the United States? Many of the refugee youth knew how to prove their American bona fides. One 16-year-old boy responded, quote, I feel myself to be very fortunate to enjoy the quality and liberty that prevails in the U.S. Having said that, these attempts at emotional formation did not prove determinative. As they traversed borderlands, emotional or otherwise, friction emerged as refugee youth displayed behavior and self-fashioned emotions that went against the grain of the expectations of the adults around them. We know, for instance, that the vast majority of refugee youth fail to perform the role of a refugee child, grateful, cuddly, and altogether lovable. This behavior was so widespread that, as I said, organizations switched policies and did not place refugee youth with foster families for free. But let's move away from the words of social workers and examine how the youth themselves carved space to create their own emotional narratives. As you may remember, Lily Lozer, trapped in Portugal while her daughters relocated to New Jersey, urged emotional vulnerability in her letters to her girls. She deeply desired to have a window into their emotional worlds and affirmation and performance of their roles as mother and daughter. But even when they seemingly ceded to this wish, the daughters likewise resisted. One exchange proves illustrative. In this correspondence, Yuta attempted to lay bare her frustration with the long wait for a visa and her longing for her mother. So I'm just going to read a little bit, but it's up here too. I got your letter in which you wrote your feelings about our reunion. I read your letter and I read it and I cried. I cried because I miss you so. But I think you're right about us being united in Portugal wouldn't be a good idea. It is better this way, to wait until we will have the day which will soon come. The war with Germany will be over by spring, so they say. But then we will have to wait for the Japs to be finished, and that will be soon, I hope. Only if I could see your face for 1 second. Why am I complaining for, if there are people who have more to wait for than me? The people in France, Poland, and the men who are dying to bring liberty to all. No, I cannot complain. I must wait, and I will wait. Don't mind me, dearie. I just think that way sometimes. Let us be patient and happy while we wait. The only thing that is on my mind is you, and the day you will arrive. That is all I want, and I'll get it, because I pray for it every night, just like I pray for Opa and Papi. Well, that was just a little chat with myself for you to hear. I love you. Kisses and hugs. In this passage, Yuta voiced her emotions of longing and sadness and admitted her tears. For a brief moment, she allowed her composed facade to crumble. She inhabited the role of the child. But Yuta quickly retreated from this ephemeral state of vulnerability. Soon after touching upon her sadness, she employed several strategies to back away from her emotions and state of childhood dependency. First, she placed herself on an equal plane with her mother, concurring on the wisdom of Lozer's plan to continue the wait for a visa and reunite in the United States. Next, she assured her mother and herself of her emotional strength and maturity to endure a familial separation. She will wait, she proclaims. And then she minimized her own sadness by contextualizing her relative fortune within the greater war effort and the larger pain of American soldiers and European civilians. Subsequently, she suppresses her emotional pain, preferring to cheer herself and her mother by suggesting that they remain patient and happy. And finally, she downplays the emotional import of her admission by referring to it as a little chat. Rather than age and gender-based expectations of the homesick and vulnerable child, Yuta opts for the role of the mature, if somewhat emotionally evasive, semi-adult. As I conclude, I wish to think about how youth describe their experiences retrospectively in their testimonies. And I'm going to return to Richard Shifter, the Viennese teenager who crossed Atlantic on his own, and then, when touching foot in the United States, scrambles to assist his parents. He never realized his hopes for a family reunion. His parents most likely perished during the liquidation of the Maidan Tatarsky ghetto. While still alive, however, and able to correspond with their treasured only son, Balbina and Paul Shifter had largely received letters that made clear his love and care for them, his laser-like focus on arranging their emigration, and his scholarly and social accomplishments. The image that Richard Shifter projected of himself gave his parents cause for comfort. They gained a different perspective, however, from the uncle who cared for the teenager and likewise faithfully corresponded with his parents. In the words of his uncle, the teenage Shifter remained upset about his parents' situation all the time. And yet this anxiety and depression largely went unvoiced in his letters to his parents. Years later, as a former Ritchie boy, a retired lawyer, a high-level diplomat, the 93-year-old shifter, dressed in a formal suit, sat to give a 5-hour testimony to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. Here, too, an alternative narrative emerges. The story that he tells of his life speaks to his profound faith in American democracy and the doors that a tolerant society can open for ethnic minorities. The majority of the interview dwells on politics. Zionism, anti-Semitism, democracy. His discussion of his parents and their death remains cursory. But then, when the interviewer attempts to draw out a discussion of his emotions during those years of distress and familial separation, he demurs. The interviewer directly addresses his emotional landscape at the time, and she says, "Reading those letters from the ones that I was able to read, you write about your efforts to go to various consulates. You also write things about how you missed them, how you hope to see them soon in New York, how in some ways one gets the impression of a young boy who is very connected to his parents, who is not only doing his duty, but feels an emotional tie and has an emotional tie that is very strong. I can't imagine what it was like for you to come to the conclusion," meaning that his parents had died, "barely 2 or 3 years later, after such high hopes, that imminently they are getting a visa." And Shifter, in response, he nods, he smiles, but he does not engage on screen. "Yeah, well, at a certain point, I just realized what the situation was. The New York Times didn't really cover it that well, and one thing that I started to read at the time was a Jewish daily forward in Yiddish." In keeping with the tenor of the rest of the interview, and perhaps gendered norms regarding testimony, Shifter retreats to his comfort zone, public events. The 93-year-old Shifter has political lessons to impart about the dangers of ethnocratic racist regimes. But lost to us is a determined but also desperate teenager of the mid-century. And yet these contradictory glimpses of Richard Shifter and the other refugee youth who made their way to the United States have much to reveal about what emotions and age can tell us about Jewish and Holocaust history. In terms of the snapshot of the sources discussed this evening, we have seen how young refugee youth fashioned narratives during the war that highlighted themes of agency and choice, strategies that speak to how they attempted to navigate social and familial hierarchies during a highly disempowering moment in their lives. Now, considerations of agency are not new to the study of the Holocaust. Historians for many years have preferred to harness and foreground the voices of ordinary Jews to explain how they made meaning or made choices or choiceless choices as their worlds crumbled. And this laudable quest has filtered down to multiple offshoots of Holocaust history, including children during the Holocaust. As one historian of children during the Holocaust has summarized the trajectory of the field, earlier scholars had failed Nazi-era Jewish youth by denying them agency, whereas a newer cohort of Holocaust historians no longer wish to treat them as voiceless victims. And historians of Jewish refugees are no different. They too turn to the sources left behind by refugees to explain the economic and social networks, the decision-making calculus, and the sense of desperation and anxiety that drove their escapes. And for those that have sought to document the emotional worlds of Jewish victims, they too draw a link between emotions and actions of Holocaust-era Jews. But our discussion this evening has drawn attention to the language of emotions, their inherent power dynamics, and the potential gulf between emotions and experience. I wish to ask the extent to which we can document children's agency or study emotions to explain decision-making and experience. Expressions of loss and victimhood, even if they are prominently present in the minds of refugee youth, which I don't doubt, are sporadically found in the archival record. Rather, American norms and adult expectations tended to favor resiliency, autonomy, and action. But these preferences may, on some level, have accorded with the desires of younger, unaccompanied refugees too. Individual emotional experience and collective emotional norms are deeply entangled. Also, learning to conform and to successfully navigate cultural and emotional expectations can represent an empowering and agentific experience. The sources left behind by refugee youth leave many questions unanswered, but they do speak to how emotions were instrumentalized in the service of comforting oneself and others, and how unaccompanied child migration and familial separation could involve a combination of empowerment and loss. Thank you.
Okay, now let's go over there. Well, Daniella, I want to thank you for a really moving talk. I'm going to open up the Q&A with some directions for all of you, which is you should have received a card, or if you didn't already receive one, maybe you'll get one now. If you have a question, please write your question on the card and pass it to Emily or Catherine, and they will bring it up to me. I feel like a theme of your beautiful talk was writing, because so much of the way that these emotions are expressed is through writing. And maybe in part that's your sources. But it just really struck me that we're talking about children's writing. And I wonder, just to get us going, how you think about children's capacity for language, how that capacity shifts as they're living in a different country. What do you see in their writing? How hard is it for children to express emotion in writing? And how does that change over time?
And I would add a complication, express themselves in a language that they are becoming increasingly distant from, right? As they become more immersed in American language and lose their natal language, right? And try to express themselves in a German that they have a harder time mastering the more and more time that they are in the United States. So yeah, so absolutely age both delimits the historical actors that I'm able to write about. So for instance, I write about Yuta, the older child, whereas Gabi, right, her letters are more like, today we went to the park and then we had ice cream and I love you, mommy, so that's part of the complication, right? And that's part of why I really want to think about the extent to which we are able to say much about the experiences of children, what is going on in their head, and how we can write their history, because there are multiple layers of complication that really serve as real barriers there.
Right. And what I love about your presentation and this research is, at once you really make us aware of those barriers and how adult expectations of children shape what we can see. And yet at the same time, when we hear these sources, they're so immediate. You can't help but react. Every one of us was once a child and relate to these children, or some of us are parents thinking about the parents, or something so incredibly immediate. Okay, here's another question that I'm going to read, but also add on to. Has there been a comparison between the American refugees and the British kinder transport children? And I'm going to add to that. I know previously you worked on children in France, child survivors. And one of the things that you and I once talked about many years ago,
I'm sure.
many years ago,
Yes.
is that in the French context, there's much more tendency to place children in collective living settings, whereas in the British and American context, they always went into families.
Yeah.
Is there such a comparison out there, or can you make a comparison based on the fact that you've researched more than one context?
So no, there has not, that I know of, been a comparison between the kinder transport and these refugee youth, although there is this survivor group of refugee youth, and they kind of refer to themselves as like the American kinder transport. Actually, their papers are here at the museum. And I think because it's kind of the more familiar story, and as a way of kind of reinforcing the fact that this happened too in the United States. But no, I don't know anyone who's done that work. But yes, in the continental European context, children were more likely to be placed in collectivities and children's homes with the idea that that was therapeutic. Americans and Brits preferred families with the idea that that would be therapeutic to them. And actually, Ernst Papanek, the person who I love but neglected to actually speak about this evening because I was worried about time, was a Austrian Jew who lived in France during the war and headed a children's home. And then in 1942 comes to the United States with a group of children. And he lands here, and he works for an American branch of a European Jewish children's organization. And he firmly believes that the children should be placed in children's homes. And he basically gets fired over this issue. And he has much to say about how the Americans get it wrong. And they have no idea that these children need to be with other children who have similar experiences, not alone with some foster families. And, there was a compelling argument there because these were difficult family placements. And children generally did not stay in the same home. They bounced around. And these were often rather tumultuous experiences. And so, it could be that Papanek was right, but he didn't have much sway in the end.
It's a fascinating thing to be talking about here in the United States, where a commitment to children being in families is so strong. It's really interesting to consider, wow, that might not be the only way to do things.
And I mean, an earlier part of this book, from which this talk this evening is a part, is interested in that because when the idea of bringing tens of thousands of children to the United States was raised, part of the objection was, well, they should not be separated from their families.
Right.
And so the politics of what does a family mean within America and American society, I'm very much interested in teasing out.
Right. We've got some great questions that have come in. Thank you all. I'm going to read this one because it's kind of definitional. As a youth historian, how do you decide where and how to delineate ages to include and exclude from your analysis?
Mm-hmm. Well, in some ways, the history makes it easy for me in that the youth were under the age of 16 for visa issues. And so that is...
They're called youth.
They're called youth. And I'm somewhat careful with how I refer to them, children versus youth. I generally prefer youth as like a general catch-all. But yes, this is a question that historians of childhood wrestle with age and terminology, but my cohort is under the age of 16, and I certainly would comfortably refer to them as youth.
Daniella, I am sitting here with 4 questions that are basically the same, and I think that's really telling.
Okay.
They are versions of, can you tell us what happened to these families, to these children? Were they reunited with their parents? How much do you know about it? What if they were? What were their reactions? It's very hard to just listen to this slice of their lives and not want to know, what do we know about their later lives, including what happened to them, but also how did they feel later? Did they experience depression and mental illness? Someone asks. Yeah.
Okay, so there's no way for me to like answer all the stories, right? But so I'll frame it this way. So actually, when I started this research, I just expected that most would be rendered, if not all, almost all would be rendered orphaned, that they would lose their families. Far more had surviving relatives, parents, than I would have guessed when I started this research. So yes, many, not all, were reunited with one family member, sometimes if they're lucky, 2 parents. And there's partly, as I believe, this really has to do somewhat with visa issues. Like the parents happen to be higher on the visa list, and they did actually make their way, sometimes to Cuba first and then to the United States, or they made it to the United States. Some were obviously rendered orphaned. Phyllis Matson, for instance, had her father left. And then when they were reunited, relations were strained. They spent years apart, and children were far older at that point, and their parents, of course, had been through something terrible, and so there were more family reunions than I anticipated, but of course they weren't perfect family reunions either. And so this is ultimately a difficult history and a difficult story.
Yeah. One of the things that really moved me in your talk was when you talked about the parents' needs. I think you actually talked about the foster parents' needs,
Yes.
and I was just like, oh. And I can only imagine at the moment of reunion, the overwhelming emotions of the parents and how that might have also affected the children.
Yes, and I, as a parent myself, like I can empathize with also the needs of the parents, and like really wanting to still be your child's parent, right? And still know what's going on with them, right? Lily Loser, for instance, like wanted to know about whether Judy started menstruating, like all these little things that she said. And she said, like, one day when you're a mother, you will understand. Because they didn't want to lose control of their children and lose their love.
Right. And this is also the hope for their own continuity and their survival.
Correct.
I have 2 questions here that are so insightful that want to kind of flip where you're shedding light away from the children to the social workers. One question is about like, what were the outcomes of what the social workers did with these children? Like, was the emotional, whatever support that they were being given effective? And the other question is just, you're looking at a certain moment in the history of social work.
Yeah.
What are some of your observations about that? What do we see in terms of what social workers are doing? What works? What clearly doesn't work?
So to weigh in whether it works or not is hard for me to say. But I guess I will say that social workers. And this was a very, it's a moment in social work. It's a moment in psychology. These social workers did not have the same sense of trauma and PTSD and creating a trauma narrative that we today have. And so social workers really focused on children becoming independent, independent, right? And that was also very American, right? Like they have to be autonomous and financially independent. And that created tension with children, with youth, because they wanted to get a better education and continue their education. And they were often pushed into kind of manual trades so that they could support themselves. Yeah. So there is a pragmatic and financial component to that, but also the idea that by being independent and autonomous, that will be empowering. Yeah. And it helped them adapt to American society. So, social workers who certainly nurtured a connection with parents and letters to the extent that that was possible, also really pressed children to Americanize, to adapt, and to empower themselves through financial autonomy. And so, again, this was a mid-century. Yeah. And so a very different moment.
Yeah. We are just about out of time, so I'm going to ask you one last question. In the scope of your research, did you find anything about intergenerational trauma, passed down from these child refugees to the next generation? I know you watched some testimonies, so you see what happened to people later.
So there's a school of scholars who are interested in kind of second generation and third generation and really tracking the idea of trauma over time and across generations. That's not where my research has gone thus far, but certainly there's a library out there of scholarship that's really interested in that question. And it certainly stands to reason that people who have difficult childhoods, that's something that they wrestle with over the course of their lives. And that could be passed down too. But I'm mainly interested, when I look at testimonies, I'm really interested in the narratives that these individuals construct, and how they deal with emotions and how they think about being a refugee, a child refugee, and how they navigate kind of Holocaust memory and Holocaust identities.
Daniella, thank you so much. You've given us so much to think about, and I think we're going to keep looking to read your work as it develops. I also don't want to leave this stage without thanking Leah Wolfson and Catherine White, who did so much to make tonight possible. Also, Emily Fisher and Nicole Millard, and all of you audience for showing up. We have a reception for you upstairs in the Hall of Witness, so please join us and join me one more time in thanking Daniella Doron.